my grandmother told me a very terrifying story, something that she experienced. This happened to my grandfather. She said she witnessed my grandfather being possessed by a demon. It happened when they were leaving their beach house. They saw 3 people wearing long hooded cloaks, and they had a pentagram sign engraved on the sand. As my grandparents were leaving the beach, those people turned towards my grandfather, specifically my grandfather, and they were whispering and chanting something in another language. My grandmother thought that was weird, that they were only focusing on my grandfather. My grandparents paid it no mind, and they left. 2 days later, that's when my grandmother noticed that my grandfather was acting strange. It started off with him mumbling to himself at night. On another occasion, my grandmother would wake up to see my grandfather standing over my grandmother, laughing and giggling. This began to freak her out, but then things got a lot worse. My grandfather one day was running a very high fever, and so my grandmother took him to the hospital because she thought maybe he could have had an infection. But when the doctors did their exam on my grandfather, they didn't find any type of infection. The only thing they did was give my father a prescription to help lower his fever, and they kept him for a day. The following day, my grandfather was discharged. 2 days later, after being discharged from the hospital, my grandmother had to leave to go to work, leaving my grandfather home alone to recover from his fever. When she came back from work the next morning, she was met with a sight that would haunt her forever. She went upstairs to check on my grandfather to make sure that he was alright, but when she got into the room, she noticed that my grandfather's body was levitating, and then his levitating body stood upright, and she noticed that his face changed, and he had green eyes, glowing green eyes, staring at her. And then my grandfather began to speak to my mother, but the thing is, it wasn't his voice. It was a dark, demonic, growling voice. My grandmother didn't know what to do at that moment. Something was going on with her husband. This wasn't him. Something or someone took over him. Immediately, my grandmother closed the door and locked it from the outside. She ran to her neighbor for help, and luckily her neighbor knew a priest. They got the priest to come out to my grandmother's house, and the priest immediately went upstairs into my grandparents' room, and that's where the priest done an exorcism. It took about 5 hours, but luckily it was a success. The priest was able to drive out the demon inside that was possessing my grandfather. After the priest was done exorcising the demon out of my grandfather, he sat down for a while and talked it to my mother, and he asked did she notice anything strange in the last couple of weeks. And that's when her mind went back to those people dressed in cloaks. They had a pentagram on the sand. She also mentioned to the priest that those people were solely staring at her husband, my grandfather. The priest believed that those people may have summoned a demon, and that demon latched on to my grandfather, causing him to be possessed. After that, my grandfather was back to normal, and everything was okay. But my grandparents now are more careful about who they are around, and they always made sure to carry protection, especially for my grandfather. My grandmother was relieved because she thought she was going to lose the love of her life forever. But every now and then, my grandmother has nightmares about that day where my grandfather was possessed. This was the most creepiest and terrifying event that my grandmother has ever experienced, and a part of her will never be the same again after witnessing what happened to my grandfather.